Hello, and welcome to another exclusive interview as part of the Excellence series, where we dig into 6 areas of life and we see what we can find to become more excellent. My name is Scott Kokenauer, and I'm your host, and I'm so glad that you've taken time out to tune in. My guest today is an award-winning writer, a consultant, coach, and speaker with 2 doctorates, and for over 30 years has been helping churches maximize health and growth. His name is Bob Whitesel, and hello, Bob. Thanks for joining.
Hi, Scott. Good to be here with you.
All right. So um, we we are in serving strong. We're talking about clarity, and one of the areas is
Mm,
vocational clarity. Now the others are they are spiritual, relational, financial, emotional, physical, and then vocational. So what we're really kind of zeroing in on here is vocational, but it has impacts on the other systems, as is always the case. We're bringing clarity to the vocational, and in particular, um, I think all of us are hoping to get past the pandemic. We like the phrase post-pandemic because we want to be on the other end of it. And I understand you've written a book. Tell us about that book. What's the title? What's the gist of that?
Well, it's a book that's kind of pulled from all of my previous books. There were 13 books before that. And so I was able to take ideas and concepts that I applied maybe 5, 10 years ago and apply them now and reapply them to this post-COVID period that we're hopefully going to enter soon.
Mhm.
And so what I discovered is that most churches are optimistic. Most leaders are optimistic about growth after the pandemic, but most research shows that it's going to be difficult to grow churches after the pandemic. So I've spent most of my time in this past 30 years coaching churches, researching churches as a professor to equip pastors. And I like what you say about vocational equipping. Equip pastors in their vocation to introduce people to a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Scott, that's what it boils down with me, is that I believe that's the most important relationship a person can have. How can we do this more effectively? It's going to require some different ways of doing things, and that's what I've been studying and applying to this new era we're entering.
You're saying then we will have to change again.
Yeah.
More.
The good thing about the pandemic, if there can be anything good, is that it forced churches to make changes that they wouldn't have made elsewise. If you had told a church, I want you to not meet for 9 months, they would have just said, there's no way we're going to do that. But when the society forces them to not meet, then suddenly they start investing in electronic mediums, in cameras, in streaming. That's all good. The problem is, if the early pandemic in the early 1900s that we saw the Spanish flu, there was a lot of organizations that failed after that because they went back to their old way of doing things. And Jesus uses a kind of interesting but symbolism of a dog returning to its own regurgitation. Mm-hmm. And that is what the church will have a tendency to do. So I wrote this book to show practical, vocational ways you can ensure that changes you started continue on, that you don't return to your old way of doing things, and that you connect with a society today that is increasingly less interested in church. I wish that weren't the case.
Yeah.
They're increasingly less interested in church. So we're going to have to change some things to connect with them.
Well, and this book talks about practical ways. What I find interesting is that constraint can breed creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't always. Like you said, there are organizations that end up dying because of a huge disruption, but it's the ones who take that disruption and that constraint and let it help them develop creativity. So you referenced practical ways. Do you have a practical idea right now for the pastor or the volunteer, the lay leader? What's one practical thing that we can do as we go into this post-pandemic?
Yeah. Embrace becoming a hybrid ministry. And by that, I kind of use the term hybrid church, to be a church that's both on-site and online. This new electronic modality of communication is changing the world. And most churches are only embracing online communication during the pandemic and are hoping to go back to it. I hear pastors say it all the time. I analyze churches, I coach churches across America, North America, and I hear pastors saying, well, I can hardly wait till we get back together. I love seeing you face to face. That's okay, but what it's doing, it's sowing in people's minds that we're going back to the way we were as church. Today, the electronic mediation of our society has totally changed the way we work. Working from home is a bigger issue, and people are continually doing it. I have 4 daughters, and they're all gainfully employed in executive leadership roles in companies, and they're all now working for these large companies online and from home. And so the church is going to be the same way. It means that your building, you may not have to have rooms for your staff. It means your Sunday schools will meet virtually. And I have one client church in which the older Sunday school, the older members, started meeting virtually, and they really didn't want to. And they told me, they said, Dr. Whitesel, we don't want to move our class online. We're going to try it. It won't be the same. We're not going to do it for long. And now, as we're kind of coming out of the pandemic, they're decided to keep part of their class online forever for those people who are immune compromised and who want to have the fellowship but don't want to get face to face with people where they might share germs. So that's an example of a Sunday school class embracing a hybrid ministry for the future.
Yeah. The fact that getting back together face to face is not wrong, it's just now incomplete, right? So hybrid, you're talking about both face and screen, correct?
Yeah, and many people, and I was this way myself. I retired after 23 years, 11 months as a professor. And in those years, I started off, I love face-to-face. And I was a young professor, and they came to me and they said, Bob, do you want to teach more classes? I said, sure. And they said, well, you're going to have to teach them online. I go, I don't want to teach them online. They said, no, you didn't hear us. If you want to teach any more classes, you're going to have to start teaching online. So I was one of the first 4 people that was taught to teach online on this Christian university now, which has over 10,000 students, I think over 10,000, around that many online.
Right. And, so the constraint was imposed upon you.
Yeah. Right? And I don't really enjoy online as much as I do face-to-face. But I discovered that my ministry is going to be a hybrid ministry. So even today in these consultations I do, rather than coming and lecturing in these consultations, people bring me in 4 times a year as a consultant to coach their leaders. Rather than teaching the first hour, I actually have a pre-recorded video, a course on churchleadership.university. And they go there and they take the course and they get the lecture and they get the notes and they can take a little quiz about what I said. And so when I come live, they've had all this pre-knowledge that they've gained from this churchleadership.university course. And it's a hybrid version of coaching, of consulting. So I've had to adopt that in my own ministry. As a professor, I had to adopt, when I retired as a professor, I was teaching mainly online. I only had, I think, out of my entire load, I think I had 2 courses all year that were face-to-face. Yeah. So it's the future, whether we like it or not.
What has been the most creative thing that a church has done to be hybrid?
I think, that's a good question. The most creative thing I've seen is communion. And sharing communion online. Now, in some churches that have a theological view of that, like the Greek Orthodox Church, will have a problem in doing that. And I've not seen that they have done that. They have instead, had people come for personal communion. But one of the things is the communion experience is supposed to be a celebration. It took place in the Last Supper, which was the Passover celebration of liberation. And so I've seen churches create a fellowship where people bring their food and they have a meal and they actually sit in front of their screens, eating together, talking, laughing, conversing. They have chat rooms they can move off to converse kind of privately. And then they all come together and the pastor leads them in communion. Now, these are creative things I could never think of. But these churches did because they were pressed to have some sort of online alternative. So the future hybrid church is going to have online alternatives for almost everything. It's going to have online alternatives for worship. When this first started, I had one worship leader say to me, a large mega church that I was coaching, she goes, Dr. Whitesel, we'll never be able to have worship online like we have on site. Well, now she's organized these online worship expressions where on the screen you have all these different worship leaders and they're singing in unison and they're singing together. And it's exciting. And she told me just recently, she said, I was wrong. She said, we can worship online. It's different, but we can.
Yeah. So the physical aspect of worship isn't there, right? You're side by side and people in front of you, people behind you, but you're in a screen, right? And you're seeing everybody on the same screen.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Yeah.
So let me talk about change, because you can't avoid it, right?
Yeah.
Change,
Churches try, but you can't.
You can't. And it's more profound now. So tell us, how do we even start changing?
Well, there's actually a process. And when I worked on my PhD, I went to Fuller Seminary, and I went to Fuller and I said, I want to study church change. And the first professor I went to, he said, well, that's kind of interesting, but wouldn't you rather talk about? So I said, and the second professor I went to, Dr. Eddie Gibbs, he said, church change. That's what no one's talking about, but everybody's struggling with. And I said, exactly. And he said, you'll be the first person to do this. He said, but the professors at Fuller you won't have enough professors who know about church change. So I got the okay to actually study under Kent Miller at Michigan State University and Roger Finke and other at Penn State University and other of these people who study church change from a secular organizational viewpoint, and found that there's actually 8 steps. And I put this together, actually, as a website that I put together called 8 Steps for Change. The 8 and the 4 are numbers. 8 Steps for Change. Or you can just go to my leadership.church site and there's a link there. But basically, here's where most people blow it, Scott, is the pastor usually is a visionary. And he or she wants to come in and share the vision of what's to be done. Now, research has shown, it starts with John Kotter at Harvard University, who is a professor of organizational leadership and management. He first came up with these 8 steps of organizational change after reading thousands of student papers. Well, during my PhD work, I have over the years read maybe thousands of student papers, and I see when change works and when it doesn't work. And I noticed that those 8 steps that Kotter outlined are exactly identifiable in the church. And the first is that the pastor is not supposed to tell the church how to bring about the change. The pastor is not supposed to bring about, there you go, that's the website.
There's the page.
The pastor is not supposed to bring up the mechanics of the change. Rather, and this is what Kotter found, the leader is supposed to create the urgency. So the leader's job is to create a sense of urgency that we have to change or we will die. We have to change or the new ethnicities moving into the neighborhood won't connect with us. We have to change because we can't stay in this building any longer because it's falling apart. We have to change because we need to add a new service. We have to change because we have to sell this building. Now, the mechanics of selling the building, adding the new service, reaching out to a new culture. Typically, the pastor thinks that he or she is supposed to come up with those mechanics. Kotter found that's when it fails, because the people in the pews, the local people, know better what changes will work and what won't work. So what Kotter said, and this is the second step, is you form a powerful guiding coalition. You can see it on your screen right there. The first step is the leader establishes a sense of urgency. So going back to that first step, I tell pastors, don't go out there and tell them, say, hey, this church did it this way, and we're going to do it like that. Or that church did it that way. That's the way we should do it. You don't know the best way to do it. I believe God's put the Holy Spirit in your leaders and your board members. And if they're on your board and they have the Holy Spirit in them, then they ought to have some insight. And rather, Kotter found in a secular environment, but it applies to the church environment, the second step is to form a powerful guiding coalition. These are leaders, thought leaders, opinion makers in the church who you bring together and you say, okay, we have to sell our building, or we need to offer an online presence. How
Mhm.
can we do this? And everybody contributes together. If the pastor, him or herself, comes and says, here's how we're going to do it, some people are going to say, well, that's not going to work here. Others are going to say, I've got input. They didn't ask me about it. People from different cultures are going to say, you're not considering the people in my culture. So I have a client church in which they have like 7 different cultures, I think 5 different languages and 7 different cultures meeting separately. But in most of the decisions, those groups are not consulted. So they don't feel like they're giving any input. So the
Mhm.
secret to change is for a team of representatives to make the change. And what you as the leader do is you show them why we have to change. Why is it urgent that we change? Now, this creates a powerful guiding coalition, and that coalition then puts together a vision of what the change looks like. So that's the third step, a
Yeah,
vision of what the change looks like. And I'll just go
sure,
through one more step, and then people can go to this website. They can look at it more if they want to.
sure,
But the
sure.
fourth step is to share the vision in a story. And here's what some a researcher, a colleague of mine, found out, that you are 65% more likely to bring about change if you attach a story. A story helps people visualize. So one of my friends is a pastor and a founder of a church called 12 Stone Church. What a crazy name we first hear, 12 Stone. But people know the biblical story in the Old Testament that when they were going into the promised land, God held up the Jordan River so they could walk across on dry land. When they got the other side, God said, put 12 stones for the 12 tribes of Israel. There's like a pyramidal structure in the river. So people always know this is where you came across, and God did a miracle. And so this church changed its name. I think it had a name like Cornerstone or something like that before. Changed it to 12 Stone because it's going to be a church where miracles happen and where it's a testimony to miracles. And I went to their church. I was analyzing it. I met some of the people and I asked them, I said, what's 12 Stone mean? And their byline is many bold crossings. And this one lady said to me, she said, many bold crossings. My husband is not a believer, and I believe one day he's going to become a Christian. That's going to be a bold crossing. Wow,
Oh,
right there, your
wow.
chain of
Yes.
emphasizing conversion and transformation is summed up every time people say your church name.
Wow.
So
Fascinating.
story is really critical to
Mhm.
bringing about the change.
Mhm. Right, right. Wow, that is just, and there are 4 more steps, and it kind of follows Cotter's Leading Change book,
It
correct?
does, exactly.
But it's tailored to the church unique and
Yeah,
specific,
exactly.
and the challenges that churches have specifically. Wow, this is really helpful. This will give the church leader, the lay leader, a track to run on, something to put together. And I love the stories idea. That's great because people remember the stories, right?
Yeah, exactly. Could be a story of Gideon, could be any of the Old Testament or New Testament stories that's attached to the change. Help people internalize that change and to run with it. But I want to say this, Scott, it's a change for a lot of pastors because we've been raised on the concept of the solo pastor, the visionary. We've been
Mm.
raised on an Old Testament concept of leadership. And I taught leadership for those 24 years, almost 24 years at Indiana Wesleyan University. And I found all of my students, I had them write an essay at the beginning of course, what is a good leader? And all of them would look to the Old Testament. No one looked to the New Testament. And in the New Testament, they had great conflicts over reaching out to the Gentiles. These were the people who were their persecutors. And they were reaching out to the Gentiles, and some were saying, no, the Gentiles don't deserve this. Persecuted, it killed us. They, why reaching out to them? And they didn't go and, James could have got up and said, well, God showed me this is what we're supposed to do. Or Peter could have got up and said, this showed me what to do. Or Paul could have.
Mm.
Rather, they formed a coalition, and we
Right.
call it the Council of Jerusalem. And
Mhm.
so New Testament times, there's a coalition of leaders, spirit-filled leaders, who make the decision. That fits with Cotter's coalition you see there on your screen,
Right, right.
guiding coalition.
Wow. Wow. I'm happy to be talking about this because I'm sure someone listening, watching, whatever, is so confused and doesn't know where to turn. All kinds of change all over the place. It's a whirlwind, and yet here are 8 anchors, one after the other, that give clear and distinct hope. I mean, Bob, your energy, your smile, 8 steps, all of this just gives hope. And I'm grateful for having the opportunity to talk with you. Those of you watching, I'm putting up on the screen here Bob's book, Growing the Post-Pandemic Church, and some practical stuff in there. You can find him also at leadership.church, right?
Yep.
And he's also a contributor to Biblical Leadership, which is something that you and I are kind of alum in that, and a number of contributors, a tremendous website as well. So lots of stuff here. Bob, how do you think the church is going to reach people who don't yet know God? Are we going to be successful?
We will, but we have to change in our approach. The approach since I grew up has been the celebrity approach, in which the pastor is a great preacher, is a celebrity, and this leads to what we call an attractional approach. People are attracted because it's a good orator. They're attracted because of music. Now, I grew up in a church that was that way. I grew up in the church, a home church of my home denomination, Church of God in Anderson, Indiana, and going to the home church. And we had a great preacher, and he was a hellfire and brimstone preacher. He was really good. I got saved at an altar call in one of his services. Actually, my mom led me to the Lord first, and then I actually made my dedication to Christ. But then he was replaced after the church sold the old tabernacle and moved up the hill to a big, beautiful new building. They hired an intellectual. And so then the teaching was less on transformation, and it was more on sanctification. Now, I'm a firm believer in sanctification, and as someone in the Wesleyan, Methodist spirit, but the sanctification alone doesn't allow people to have that conversionary experience. So the conversionary experience has been driven a lot by the attraction in the last century. So Billy Graham, very attractive speaker, orator. People go there, they give their life to the Lord. Chuck Smith, Calvary Chapel, Greg Laurie, all the people we have today, great personages, but that in the future will not lead, I think, to conversion, because the conversion is largely because you want to join this large community following this person. You want to be part of their tribe. Today, people have jaded views of celebrities. They don't look up to senior pastors. We see these polls that show increasingly pastors going down the list of people that are looked up to and respected. One of the organizations most highly respected, all the denominations listed, one of the highest respected was Salvation Army. And it's not because of their name, because Salvation Army, you've named your church Salvation Army Church, it might scare people, but Salvation Army, people think of that as people who do good and to help others. So the transition we're going to have to make, Scott, is from being attractional to being incarnational. And incarnational means incarnate in Greek means, in Latin means in the flesh. And so we have to go in the flesh to people to serve them. So it's a need meeting church. So the future church growth is going to be on need meeting, not on entertainment. And the problem is today, people turn on their TV and they see better entertainment than we can ever offer. They can turn on, the Masked Singer or, America's Got Talent, and they'll see much more entertainment than they find at church. So the entertainment angle for churches is gone. I don't think it's ever coming back. I don't think it's good, because it puts pastors up on too much of a pedestal, and it's hard for them to live a life up there. So it's better to say, and this is what I do with my client churches. In fact, I'm coaching several churches right now that have had famous pastors in the past. They're big mega churches with famous pastors, and we're moving them from being pastor attractional to being need meeting. So people know them in the community for their food bank. People know them in the community for their jobs program. So in my recent books that my books over the past 5-6 years, I've stressed on all of them this incarnational aspect of offering need meeting programs and focusing on that rather than focusing on a great preacher and a great worship package.
Right. Well, we're coming full circle, I think, to what we really need to be doing as a church anyway, need meeting. That's
Yeah.
great. Bob, thank you so much for joining me. I
Good to
really
be here.
appreciate that. You've got such a vibrant um, approach, and you're talking about things that need to be talked about. Thank you. And maybe we'll bring you back on. I
Me
mean,
too.
there's so much to talk about with change, right?
There is a lot.
All
A
right.
lot.
All right. Thank you very much.